Hello and welcome back to the Star Trek CCG First Edition set discussion and pack opening series. I'm Mike Sember, joined by Johannes Klarhauser, Dan Winterhalter, and Tom Target, where we crack open one of every of the 17 Star Trek CCG First Edition booster packs while discussing each set as we do so. In this video, we're diving into the Deep Space Nine set, which came out in summer of '98, consisted of 277 cards. Compared to First Contact, I consider it a double expansion because there were 80 commons and 80 uncommons compared to the 40 of each in First Contact, and double the rares in 100. This set also had 16 missions, which came in solely in the starter decks. And like Premiere, this set was really the first after Premiere to come out with starter decks. And these starter decks were designed to be played right out of the box, unlike the Premiere versions. This set also had one preview card. Every 200 packs, you got to open a Whiteboarder Defiant, which I am imagining Johannes, Dan, and Tom will say is what we want to open, and which is exactly what I want to open. Although maybe not. Deep Space Nine too. Anyway, getting ahead of myself here. The Whiteboarder Defiant preview card, first preview card in this set, and this set also I think paired quite nicely with Dominion, the next set, as far as playing well together. But enough from me, Johannes. What did Deep Space Nine do for Star Trek CCG gameplay?
Well, obviously it introduced two entirely new affiliations, the Bajorans and the Cardassians, that compared to the Borg that we looked at last time, now play more like traditional affiliations in that they attempt missions and start with outposts and so on. That of course means that in this set we will also find a lot of basics, we will find outposts for these missions, we will find treaties, we will find espionage cards, so they had to put all those cards in here as well. But it also introduces a couple of new elements. For example, we have our first entirely new quadrant in the Gamma Quadrant, and we will have the Bajoran wormhole that allows us access to that quadrant. It also does interesting things with missions, in that we now have missions that are designated to be in specific regions, meaning you would then have to see them adjacent to other missions in that region, allowing you to control the space line a little bit. And this set also has cards that make use of the homeworld trait that is introduced here. So the espionage mission would now then be the Federation homeworld. And likewise, the Klingons and Romulans already have missions in the game that are now their homeworlds, and there are cards that do things with that. And what probably causes a lot of confusions is the space station mechanic. The old Cardassian mining stations, the Nors, specifically Deep Space Nine, Terok Nor, the double-sided card, and the regular Nor, and the new associated card type Site, which is quite complex compared to regular reporting to the outpost that we have known so far. This is a lot more intriguing. You can do a lot more things with that, but it's also a lot more to work through if you're just learning the game, and many people find it just too heavy-handed and too complex. I tried to do a little video on my channel to explain this a little bit, but I find many people who still say, let's just ignore these rules and treat them as regular outposts and then just have fun like that.
I appreciate you diving into the complex, nuanced, pieces there. I'm just hearing about this, but if you're still explaining it in that way, sounds pretty complex. Getting back to the Cardassians and Bajorans you mentioned on the Premiere set, we had the Federation, Romulans, Klingons, and we've talked in prior videos about kind of the imbalance there. How are the affiliations balanced kind of among the Cardassians, Bajorans, and Federations in the set?
Obviously, the Federation guys have the star power. We have the bridge crew. Even if we look at personnel like Jadzia Dex, they have excellent stats and attributes. But also the new guys on the block have very good personnel. So the Cardassians have Dukat, who has double leadership, double navigation, and 3 other skills as well. So they have high quality personnel. And if we look at the Bajorans, we also have personnel like Barel Antos, with diplomacy ×2, science, biology. So they all had at least one superstar personnel. And in general, I found their skill density a bit better compared to how the Klingons and Romulans started out. What they don't have are the mission specialists that we mentioned in our last video. So that's some kind of Deep Space Nine theme, that they don't have those one skill personnel, but rather they have a lot of guys that have at least 2 skills.
How about from a collector perspective? What's Deep Space Nine bring?
DS9 brings a whole new show, a whole new property icon, and for folks like me, where it's their favorite show, it's very, very desirable just for that nostalgia as well. You've got brand new cast. You have the first double-sided card in Terok Nor DS9. Every other card has had the exact same back prior to this one. So you're looking at a card where the default side was Bajoran, and the reverse was Cardassian. And so you have a card that flips based on who's taken possession of that station. And there is mechanics for how to do that that I don't know in nearly as much detail as Johannes would. It's got, you're digging into those starter decks to try and get the 16 unique missions out of them. I think there were either 4 or 5, maybe as many as 6 in each deck. So you needed to have 3 and often had to dig through 5 or 6 to get all 16. The distribution was okay, but if you happened to if you weren't pulling from the same box and were pulling randomly from what you pulled the stores, you could pull the same block of sequence of commons and uncommons that let it be playable, but also meant you were missing certain cards. You're looking at a lot of new main crew in all of the different factions, but you also can really tell as you look at the next set, the Dominion, that they had both in development at the same time, because they chose where to put certain characters that would have been really obvious to put into this set, into a later set, because they started showing up in DS9 in season 3 or season 4. And it let this be just that little bit trimmer. It's very thin on the ground as far as Federation personnel. You basically have the main crew and 1 or 2 other folks. And it is the first appearance of a dual personnel in an expansion set in Jake and Nog. And this personnel is also the first nod to the Ferengi affiliation. So hinting that the Ferengi affiliation may be coming soon, and we would hope it would be coming soon. Likewise, glaring omissions in the set include Quark. He's not in here in any fashion, and Miles O'Brien is not in here in any fashion. So Quark is again a hint that the Ferengi are coming, but we haven't figured them out yet.
I've always seen the sets of Deep Space Nine, Dominion, and Blaze of Glory as kind of like the Simon Pegg movie trilogy. It's not officially a trilogy, but they're connected enough that it's significant, especially with the Miles O'Brien card appearing in the Blaze of Glory set. He's conspicuous by his absence in this set. I think there's some other really fun notes as I look through this. We start to see an attempt at rebalancing skills with the Klingons and the Romulans. There are so few, major Romulan characters, and they've used so many of them already. We start to see this phenomenon of, oh, hey, remember that Romulan who was sitting at the table in that episode? Well, here they are, and they've got like 7 skills. This is definitely something we start to see. And right. I think Johannes mentioned this when talking about the skills in the Cardassian and Bajoran. If you look at the earlier sets, they're very much trying to keep, was there on-screen lore or words that would demonstrate that they 100% had this skill? When you look at the Cardassian sets, it's like, here's a guy who was sitting at this station one time who has like engineer, medical, and three other skills. So I think that we're starting to see the rebalance, even though the Klingons and the Romulans aren't a huge component of this set. We're starting to see that trend in making them a more playable faction. We also see a few little fun bit of text. So for example, we see the introduction of the term Klingon intelligence on a card in this set. That's kind of interesting to see as a new skill. We see another few dual affiliation cards, but remember this is still dual affiliation as in there's only one printing of it. So we have a Toraziel obviously, but we also have the Charjo as well as another dual affiliation usable card. We see the return of Q icon cards in this. So we have new Q cue cards, which we didn't have in First Contact. So we sort of skipped over that expansion. We're seeing some more returns to form in that sort of sense. And also building 2 new factions, as Dan mentioned, becomes a bit of a treadmill, in that every time you introduce a new one, you've got to think of all the treaties and all the espionages that could exist between each of the factions, and therefore you see a lot of these cards that aren't thrilling, but are necessary mechanical cards to have in order to make that faction equally playable in the same ways as all of the other existing factions so far.
One of my favorite lore cards is one of those espionage cards in this this set. It's a callback to the espionage Romulan on Klingon, I believe, that says Romulan spies are everywhere. And there's a Romulan, I believe it's Romulan Bajoran, that says Romulan spies are still everywhere.
We're also
and that's
seeing
all there is for lore, because there's no evidence, there's nothing that they can call back from an episode saying that the Romulans are spying on the Bajorans, but they are. So
we're also seeing more cards that are personas of other cards that have already been introduced. So forget alternate universe, alternate Garrux. There's an alternate Garrick coming up in many sets from this point on. So in this card, we have the introduction of a Garrick, and there's going to be many other iterations of those type of cards that we see coming through too. I think what I enjoyed the most about the DS9 set was, this is something I'm collecting after I stopped playing, and DS9 was such a big season for me. I enjoyed having the cards for it. But it's a definite fundamental shift in that, you know, I think it does still preserve the flavor of what the games are supposed to be, and then the characters are still well thought out, but they're definitely thinking much more about gameplay in terms of introducing cards and characters and skills than they are in terms of, oh, he was a great character or she was a great character from this particular episode, we have to throw them in there. So I think it was a shift towards the playability of it, and I think we are seeing most people acknowledging these 3 expansions as being the golden age of the game. Increased complexity without it becoming too difficult to play, being a good justification, even though it lacks some of the simplicity of the earlier sets. That's how I think about it.
Mm-hmm. I love the set. I think it's a lot of fun. It's one that I really wish I could just keep opening, because it's always joyful. And it's always been a little bit more scarce, or a noticeable bit more scarce than some of the other sets, and noticeably, I can get 2 or 3 boxes of this or 1 of this, and that's made it harder to just sit back and enjoy opening it from a financial perspective. But I love it. I love how many of even the espionage, the boring cards, they've done a lot of work to try and call back to interesting episodes with the pictures. When they had a choice, they chose well. And that's something that I think, referencing this was a cool character, let's give him a card. They've tried to give them a card without necessarily giving them a personnel card that feels like dead weight.
This is a speculation as well, but I think when it comes to the earlier sets, we were looking at very large print runs, because the important part was to make sure that no store ever ran out and you could recruit as many players as possible. I think, again, speculating at this point in the game's history, you're looking at more of a rationalized balance of, we have the vast majority of our player base, we hope to attract more, but they were trying to avoid overprinting, which is why sealed packs from this set were never that cheap and are relatively expensive today. For many people like myself who wanted pack fresh openings, I was never able to buy a booster box of DS9. I picked up a few starter packs, and I actually got quite a few of these cards through the Reflections set, when that was more of a reasonable price than it is today. Sure. And that was the only way I could ever seem to access them, that I knew going into all of these sets, sealed product was no longer an option for me financially.
My question is going to be, why was it harder for me personally to find Deep Space Nine? Dominion a little less so, in Blaze of Glory, and you're talking about the scarcity. Was there also a piece where this was kind of the golden age of the game and people were really kind of taking more of a liking to these sets, opening them up, or are you saying primarily due to the scarcity that it's harder to get these packs now?
I believe that it's probably they printed fewer on the basis of it was worth saving the money on overprinting because they knew who their market was and its rough size. Whereas in the early days of a card game, you typically want to overproduce to make sure that absolutely anyone who ever wants to buy it can buy a pack, even if that means overproducing, like we see today with the overabundance of 95. So I think we're entering this era of they are printing towards a better understood market size, which means that it was not scarce at the time, but doesn't have the sheer abundance that some of the earlier sets still do 20 years on from its printing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll mention this or ask again in Voyager, but as far as the big three shows, Next Generation, DS9, Voyager, that this game kind of carried, coming back into the game, it was interesting, seeing like, you mentioned the overproduction. Oh, Next Generation is so accessible to get into, to play these characters, and it's like, finding, like you had said, a box, like if you love DS9 to play, is a lot harder. And when we get to Voyager, we'll talk about that too, having watched like, oh, I just watched a ton of Voyager, and it's, oh, well, Next Generation is so accessible, these other series are harder to play. Johannes, jump into the player perspective. What do we want to open from this pack here?
I would want to open Jadzia Dex. She was my at the time she was probably young me's favorite character, and she also has very good skills. So I always liked her. I'd probably want to open the Defiant though. I've never opened one in a Deep Space Nine pack. I didn't have a lot of Deep Space Nine. I think I had 2 starter decks and about maybe half a booster box worth of cards, but that was at the time when the one friend who was still occasionally playing with me didn't find it interesting anymore. And so that's where my playing break began, and my next experiences with the game in that fashion were then later on when we did callback tournaments where we'd use a historic card pool and then play with that. But I've never actually played with those cards when they came out in a tournament setting.
What are the most visible or played cards in tournaments now from, I guess you can combine them all, Deep Space Nine, Dominion, Blaze, but specifically I guess from DS9?
Interestingly enough, I was looking at the verb cards, so interrupts and events here. So one of the very good cards here is Going to the Top, an interrupt that allows you to download a personal with leadership ×2. Now, obviously, there weren't too many of those, but some very good ones. And that's an extra personal you could get into play. And that was huge in a period of the game where the game was mostly play one card, draw one card. So that interrupt was very powerful. Likewise, Hidden Fighter, an interrupt that allows you to download a ship. And it also gave you established landing protocols, so you could land your ship on a planet, and that gave you some way to play around ship battle. So that was also quite interesting. We had a new Captain's Order card in Defiant Dedication Plaque that gave your ships extra range if they had a matching commander aboard. There was HQ Secure Homeworld, which is still often played these days to attempt your homeworld mission, where you can start, you can report personal there, but an affiliation usually can never attempt their own homeworld unless they have a card like HQ Secure Homeworld. And I think one of the most important cards here is actually Process Ore, because that is a card that allows you to draw an extra card and also discard cards from your hand that you don't need anymore. So once you have set it up, you can discard one card from hand, and then you can draw 2 cards. So that was a very useful addition to the game, I found.
All right, how about from the collector perspective? What do we want to open here?
So really the most valuable is the double-sided Deep Space Nine Terra Ignore. Even though it's not as rare as the White Border Defiant, most collectors, I know I had to have 2 for my collection. It wasn't enough to just have the one and know the other side was there. I had to have both, and that so doubles the demand for so many people that I think that still remains on top. The USS Defiant, second most valuable card in the pack. And then surprisingly, because of its sort of ubiquity in use in many ways, the Defiant Dedication Plaque is actually more valuable than most of even the very famous personnel in the set. Once we get past those top 3, it's all fairly obvious. So your Benjamin Sisko, your Jadzia Dax, your Julian Bashir, Kira and Odo, very valuable cards to come out of this, as well as the Dukat and the Elon Garrett cards for the Cardassian side. Other cards of note of value would be Garrick's Tailor Shop. It's the only sort of very valuable site. It's a rare site, which it's rare. The Cardassian ships, the Aldara, the Gramal, and the Pakesh, are all quite valuable cards. Any of the Homeworld cards, which in this one's was the Bajoran Chamber of Ministers or the Cardassian Central Command. The dual personnel Jake and Nog card, is quite valuable as well, as are some of the Romulan cards are all fairly valuable. The Grilka card, especially from the Klingons, is also quite valuable. And some of the dilemmas, Garrick has some issues, is a card which has some synergy with seeding personnel that's quite useful, and I'm sure Johannes could tell us about. But really, there are some rares that might not be thrilling, but they're all of reasonable value. And that's one of the reasons I enjoy still looking through Deep Space Nine sets, because there's so many fun cards in there to play with. So there's really quite a few good ones you could draw.
And just adding to what Tom just said about the facilities, those were actually, I think, the first proper free plays that you had, in that they listed a number of personnel that can just play for free. So you can see the game speeding up there. You have your regular card play, but to the Chamber of Ministers, you could, for example, also report a Vedic in addition to that for free. And then you had the going to the top for downloads. If you played with the androids from the Q Continuum, you could, I think there was still the time where you could report androids for free. So the game was speeding up. Even without Red Alert, you could put more personnel into play every turn. And that, I think, made it a bit more interesting because the game accelerated a bit faster and you had more stuff on the table early on, and it wasn't such a drag to get to the point where you actually have the resources to do missions.
Moving beyond the rares, the starter deck exclusive cards actually do have some fairly decent value. They are technically listed as common cards. If you look up their evaluation, this is something that will change in future. The starter deck exclusive cards in Voyager are listed as uniquely, I think is it S or P? I forget this, that they use to denote for them. It's something different. It's S, but here we just have, they are technically commons, even though they are actually starter deck exclusives. When it comes to the uncommons, the Bajoran Wormhole card is what you'd really want to see in the uncommons, partly because you need you want two of them for a collection. I know I collect two of each card, which required two cards to play. You also need two of them to play in practice in the game. So Bajoran Wormhole is worth more than many of the rares in the expansion. The ore processing unit site is of anomalous value because of, as Johannes mentioned, processing ore. So that's also another uncommon you'd like to see. And the Bajoran Interceptor card is surprisingly valuable because the poor old Bajoran faction had pretty weak source ships at this point, especially compared to the Cardassian fleets they would often be up against. And it was only in later expansions that we saw more powerful Bajoran ships. So the Bajoran Interceptor is the best of a bad bunch for them, and that's why that uncommon card, I think, has value. On the common side, there's nothing too specific to mention except, of course, the generic Nor class stations, with Deep Space Nine and Terok Nor being quite difficult to get a hold of, and the Empok Nor station not coming up until Dominion. The generic Nor class common was, I think, a way to make sure that most people could play with sites, the new mechanic in the game, if they wanted to do so. So those are the things we'd like to see opening up this pack.
Okay, cool. Can you all see the pack?
Yep.
All right, and I've never opened up one of these before. I think I mentioned kind of my nostalgia head is off. I have never opened this set moving forward. So I'm just curious to learn more about what Deep Space Nine brings, and here we go. And I think the 6 card is rare. So I don't know what the order is, but I'm pretty sure that number 6 is going to be the Deep Space Nine or the Defiant.
Right. I love the artwork on this pack. I think I like the change we saw with First Contact, but it was a bit too green, whereas the Deep Space Nine wormhole is iconic, and I think it was just a nice. This is one of my favorite packs just to look at. I think that it looks great.
I know they're the same number of cards as the First Contact pack, but boy, this pack feels just thinner. This feels like the thinnest pack I've ever held of a Star Trek card game of the boosters. So, all right, here we go. Deep Space Nine. A dilemma right away.
Yep.
Nice.
That's a good one. I'm not sure whether the quarantine was already on a card before, but that's an interesting mechanic in that it means that your personal cannot get away. You can still be more personal on that ship, but you cannot get away. And there were some interesting combos with that card.
And if your personnel is disabled, if your medical personnel is disabled, they can't use that 2 medical. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Oh, okay. We got a Federation card here. Rojo.
So here's an example of a common card starting to see with more skills than you'd see in the earlier sets that we've seen so far.
For real. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, compare him to Deanna Troy, a bridge personnel from the first set. So he's just heads and shoulders better.
Yeah, this is consistent with what you're talking about. I mean, this just being very, very different already.
I remember go ahead, Johannes.
I was going to say that's a surprisingly good dilemma. Here we have another example of a call out to a very specific personnel that can beat this this dilemma on their own. But the remaining requirement is quite good if you don't run any cunning boosting equipment or things like that. But again, if you play in an environment where people are either playing Federation or Cardassians or Bajorans, chances are they actually have a Parker and just walk right through it.
A quick collector's note on this card. There's another card in this set, I forget the name of it, but it also features artwork from that same episode. And when sorting out stacks of cards, I often intermix the two and don't realize I'm doing it. So I either put them in one stack or cross over. So be careful when you're sorting cards with this front.
We shall pass.
That's it. That's it. This is
Nice
fun. We
runabout.
talked about. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we talked about the Runabout in the Premiere set as being a ship which doesn't have staffing requirements. A great way to move people around. And here we see some extra synergy with that ship being able to report. They're trying to combine it with this site concept to be able to bring it into play that way.
A lot of blue cards.
Sorry, can you take the Runabout back for a moment?
Sure.
Because there's reports for free to Runabout pads. There is no card that is called Runabout pads. There never was one. So the actual card, I think, is called docking pads. That's probably what they meant. But technically, this doesn't work.
They did an errata this?
I'm not sure. This is the first time I've seen this.
Huh. Interesting. Okay.
I believe they did, but I can't remember for sure. I believe virtually.
Yeah, so on the Trek CCG site, there is an errata version where it's been changed to docking pads, and it says it was errated in October of 1999. So that's Decipher's doing.
Right.
That wasn't you in 1989, just forgetting you had done that 20 years later? Good catch. Wow, okay. A lot of blue cards. I think you mentioned the blue was down, but we have a lot of blue
that's
cards.
an interesting.
Oh, this is so rare.
All right.
That's a great pull.
Okay, Jake and Nog. Wow. So can you say more about this, the dual affiliation piece here?
I loved a couple of things on this card. I love the engineer a half. That's something we'd seen with Toral and leadership a half with Duras in the 2-player set. But this is another example of dual affiliation where there isn't a mirrored version that would be the Ferengi orange color. But nonetheless, it's great to see it's a combination of dual affiliation and dual personnel cards.
Yep.
And rules-wise, this is also one of the concepts that comes up again and again. How actually do dual personnel cards work? Because there are some things that are not quite straightforward about them, and that's always a question in tournaments that you can count on coming up.
I think it was a horrific oversight not to include a download of a self-sealing stem bolt with these two characters.
I'm assuming we have an uncommon Klingon here. Some good skills.
In fact, played by Tim Russ, who plays Tuvok later.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I had asked you before, Dan, which cards get the signatures from the big name actors?
This is the one I'm hoping to get signed next week or next month.
Why don't you share where you're going, Dan? What's happening next month for you?
I'm going on the Star Trek cruise and looking forward to that very much.
How many cards are you hoping to get signed on the cruise?
Currently, I think I've got 12 for me, and I think another 8 or 9 for other folks.
Were you going to say something about this card, Tom?
Sure. So just looking at the rebalancing, here we have a card that's uncommon, but with actually a fairly good skill set. We have both security and engineer, navigation ×2, treachery. We can see cards for other factions, specifically Klingons and Romulans, which are reasonable here, especially compared to the earlier offerings we had for those sets.
Preventing battle from happening.
Was this kind of like Asteroid Sanctuary? I think it's a similar type.
Yeah, that's the same idea. Yeah.
Run away!
Oh, we have the Bajoran wormhole.
You got it. That's
Fantastic.
the uncommon you want.
All right.
You talked about that being a staple of both decks and of it's pretty common or pretty sought after. It's also sought after. I've seen a bunch of folks use that for production crew on DS9 to get autographed, because the DS9 rare is too rare, but this is still achievable. So you'll see, anyone they can from behind the scenes, they'll try and get them to sign this.
This card has a higher value than almost most of the non-personnel rares in the set, with the exception of only a few of the more valuable dilemmas and things like that.
So from a collector perspective, this is more sought after card than even Jake and Nog.
Oh no, Jake and Nog is worth twice as much as this, but but for an uncommon it's just anomalous to have an uncommon that is worth more than most of the events or interrupts or other type. Your personnel usually a bit more valuable than this, but for everything else, this is definitely a card it's always great to see.
Mm-hmm.
And we're back to the beginning. Yeah, we had a number of
great pull.
Yeah, there we go. Another pack where go ahead, Tom.
No, you've been doing great. I mean, we just had that rare mission on AU, but otherwise, there's been some really good pulls. Jake and Nog is in the top. Is in the top set here. It's always in demand, and to get a wormhole as well is pretty special.
The theme of cards we've actually talked about before opening the pack popping up in the pack is something that has been nice from my end for sure. So.
Absolutely.
All right, there's our pack.
Thinking about collecting this set, something I noticed is that we'll see something terrible in the future, which is the Tribble reprints of many of the cards for this sets. That's a dark time coming up for us to have that discussion. But do keep an eye when collecting even DS9 cards to watch out for that. You of course want the 1998 date printed on there rather than the 2000 Tribble reprints date. So Tribble reprints affect everything: First Contact, DS9, Dominion, Blaze of Glory. So do keep an eye out open for those.
They go all the way back to Q and AU.
Yeah, it does keep going back, but those are the ones I'm far more upset by getting something I thought was an excellent DS9 or Dominion card as opposed to something from that. So
can you clarify where are these cards going to be reprinted?
In the Tribbles Precon starter decks.
Okay, and you're saying the
discussion.
Date will be the only discrepancy?
The date's the difference, yeah. So all of these have the original 1998 for DS9. If you see, say, a Miradorn Raider, for example, has a 2000 date. The really sad parts are when they reprint the rares and you think you have a DS9 rare, but you actually have a 2000 dated rare by comparison.
Tommy, can I just ask? You mentioned the Bajoran Interceptor before as being one of the
slightly higher value of the uncommon cards.
It makes sense because if you look at the game text, it looks like a mediocre range 5, but here we have the concept of regions and it's X or it's +4, putting it on par with the USS Enterprise. So it has the same range as the Enterprise, and you can actually almost ignore the weapons and shields because with it you can land or take off. And if you pair that, for example, then with the established landing protocols, which gives you another once per turn landing or taking off option, you can actually just take off from the planet, fly somewhere, land again, and you'd never have to expose yourself to battle. So that's where this little ship actually shines. So that makes sense to me that it's a rather popular card.
And that's good to know, because thinking about a lot of, if you're having Cardassian versus Bajoran games, there's a massive imbalance in terms of the strength of the Cardassian fleet versus the Bajorans, especially in this. And that is definitely in lore consistent with how you saw those factions interact. It's actually quite nice to see that preserved, even if it made, I can see why they'd want to correct it later with more powerful Bajoran ships. but nonetheless, that's actually quite interesting.
All right, deep dive in Deep Space Nine. You kind of had mentioned, Tom, I think you had mentioned the trilogy that Dominion and Blaze of Glory are gonna kind of follow thematically from the set. So this was Deep Space Nine. We'll see y'all with Dominion.